Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for coming. For those people who don't know who I am, my name is Deverell Capps, and I'm the Dean of Leeds Law School here at Leeds Beckett University. When I invited our guest speaker to come last year, the world was a very different place. The referendum had happened, of course, but we hadn't triggered Article 50. The Prime Minister promised that there wouldn't be another general election until 2020, and Hillary Clinton looked as though she was a shoo-in for the American presidency. Oh, how things have changed. Our speaker this evening is an individual who has excelled both academically and professionally, achieving a first-class law degree from the university next door in 1985 and a BCL from Oxford a year later. He was called to the bar in 1987 and took silk in 2002. As one of the founder members of Doughty Street Chambers, an internationally renowned human rights and public law set, he went on in 2007 to be named Human Rights and Public Law QC of the Year. In 2008, he became the Director of Public Prosecutions and the head of the Crown Prosecution Service, and was responsible for all criminal prosecutions in England and Wales. He stepped down in 2013, but found something else to do. In 2014, he entered the world of politics by being chosen as the Labour Party's candidate for the constituency of Holborn and St Pancras, and was elected to office in 2015. And last year, he was appointed as the Shadow Secretary of State for exiting the European Union. Ladies and gentlemen, to speak to us this evening about Britain after Brexit, it's my great pleasure to welcome Keir Starmer QC MP.
Thanks very much, and thank you all for coming this evening for this lecture, and I hope a lively Q&A session. It's always fantastic for me to be in Leeds, because as you've heard, I was here for 3 years at what I think is called the other place. And I had 3 fantastic years at Leeds University studying law, and I absolutely love this city and try to come back as often as I can. I have to confess that when I arrived in Leeds University to study law in year 1, I didn't actually know the difference between a barrister and a solicitor. So I had a lot to learn and did learn as I went through that. I actually did know slightly more about the back streets and bars of Headingley than I did about that particular distinction. And I remember coming here regularly on a Friday night, which I hope is as lively now as it was then. Since then, I have been back many times because I've got strong friendships in Leeds. I've got a strong association with the other place. And I love coming back here. And I love seeing the city go from strength to strength. I think it's really gone from strength to strength year on year. And that includes in the legal sector, I think, where things have really, really moved on. So it's fantastic to be here. Since I left here, quite a lot has happened in my life, most of it not as planned. And as you heard, just under 23 months ago, I entered Parliament for the first time as the MP for Holborn and St Pancras. And what a 23 months it's been. A lot has been packed in to those 23 months. In my own party, we've had 2 leadership elections back to back. That's pretty unusual. We had, of course, Brexit last year, June 23rd. I passionately campaigned to stay in, and therefore it wasn't the result that I wanted. We then had a change of Prime Minister. When I was elected in, I didn't think David Cameron would be gone quite so quickly, but he was. Then we had the election of Donald Trump. And now we have a general election. That's quite a lot to cram in to 23 months. And a lot of those decisions, particularly Brexit and President Trump, were the ones that I particularly didn't want and didn't predict. And the only good thing about all that change is this, although this is something I didn't do at the time. If you'd put a fiver at the right time on Brexit, Donald Trump being elected and Leicester winning the Premiership as a triple bet, put a fiver on that, you'd got 11 million quid. Now, if you're thinking you're not so happy with what happened in some of those things last year, that would have taken the edge off it. Now, when I agreed to give this lecture, I didn't know there was going to be a general election, and I suspect most people in this room didn't. When you agreed to come, you didn't agree to come and listen to someone giving a general election speech, and so I'm going to try and avoid that. Obviously, we're all in general election mode now. There are strong messages that we're putting out and other parties are putting out, but I'm going to try today, this evening, just on the topic that we've agreed, not to deliver a partisan speech, that's not what you came to hear, but just to go through my own personal reflections and beliefs about where we are and to examine some of the profound questions that we have to answer. And I think the first thing is to just remind ourselves, of the great uncertainty that surrounds us. I think greater uncertainty now than at any time I can remember in my life, and greater uncertainty about the values that I hold dear. Some of the things that I took for granted and have taken for granted seem to me to be being challenged now more profoundly than at any time that I can remember. And I think up and down the country, from Leeds to London, a lot of people are finding that very disorientating. And there's more anxiety about the future than we've had for a very, very long time. And let me start internationally, because internationally, our foreign policy has rested, broadly speaking, on two pillars. And that rested on those two pillars for probably 5 decades or more. The first pillar has been our military and security alliance with the United States and our commitment to the collective security provided by NATO. With the election of Donald Trump, we face the challenge of an American president who does not offer unqualified support for this vital security alliance. There's been a lot of speculation as to whether Donald Trump, the president, would be the same as Donald Trump, the candidate. And since Donald Trump's been the president, there have been mixed messages, and there isn't any settled view yet as to where he sits in relation to that vital pillar. So real anxiety there. And that sits behind, I think, some of the discussions and negotiations with the EU, because until now, all EU countries have, broadly speaking, worked on the basis that the US would be supportive of the EU, both in ideas and resources, and that isn't necessarily the case. And you can see that that's causing some uncertainty in Europe itself, let alone here. The EU issued its own white paper in March that you may have seen, with 5 different possible models for the EU going forward. So it's not just uncertainty in Britain, there's uncertainty in the EU itself. And there is the question whether the President of the US actually shares our values, quite apart from supporting Europe. The second pillar of our foreign policy has been our membership of the European Union and its predecessor organisations. And that's been the central plank of our commercial and trade policy. But it's done more than that. It's shaped how we have conducted scientific research, how we've dealt with climate change, how we've tackled serious and organised crime. We've internationalised these issues because we recognise that international collaborative solutions work better than each country working on its own. And those values are really important. I campaigned to stay in the EU, and I went across the country campaigning, speaking, writing, knocking on doors, even in that bus on a couple of occasions. And I did it, and I was making the arguments about it to be better for trade, making the argument to be better for medicine, for science, for technology. I was particularly making the argument because of my role as Director of Public Prosecutions that it would be better for defeating terrorism and serious crime. But fundamentally, I was making the argument because I believe in internationalism and collaboration and cooperation. And having the EU as a central plank of our foreign policy, of the way we see things internationally, meant that those values were underpinned as the values, as you can see in any preamble to pretty well any EU document. The protection of human rights, the rule of law, peace, security are the underpinning values. And obviously after the referendum, we've got to start looking at all of this again and facing different challenges. And what is more, all of that is happening in a position of wider, I think, global uncertainty. Far-right and populist movements are on the march in Europe and in power in Russia. Now, in Europe, you'll have seen there have been some near misses in the Netherlands and Austria in the last 12 months. We wait and see what happens in France. We wait and see what happens in France. And even, although the far right won't take control, in Sweden, the far right is far more powerful than it was. And until recently, even in Germany. The German situation has changed in the last 3 months. But in the tail end of last year, the far right in Germany was polling at a higher rate than it had since the Second World War. It's quite incredible, in Germany. Now that's settled and gone in a slightly different direction, but you can see just how uncertain the political forces are. There is, of course, the continuing brutal and tragic civil war in Syria, leaving a still unresolved refugee crisis. I think one of the tragedies of Brexit is that I think pretty much since the referendum, the front pages have had almost nothing on the refugee crisis. If you think back to 12 months ago, 15 months ago, there was a lot of news and a lot of discussion about the refugee crisis. What was the best way to deal with it? Was it upstream? Was it stopping people or helping people across different borders? Where should the controls go in? There were lots of debates about refugees, and we all knew that there were more people fleeing persecution in the world today than at any time since the Second World War. That's gone off mainstream news. It comes up now and again, but rarely, actually, if you think about it, in the last 9 months. And the totalitarian regime in North Korea is saber-rattling with long-range missiles. Politics and news move quickly, but it was only 2 weeks ago we were in the middle of that tense period about North Korea. So internationally, great uncertainty is the context in which our negotiations with our EU partners are now going to take place. But it's not just uncertainty internationally, there's uncertainty at home. And I think that the referendum last year was not just a referendum on technical membership of the EU. I don't think people saw the boxes in that way. Do you technically want to be a member or not a member? Of course that was on the ballot paper. But I think sitting behind those two boxes, people saw different questions. What do you think of the state of the nation? Do you think that this political and economic model delivers for you? Are you reasonably satisfied, or are you pissed off? And I think, although there have been lots of fierce debates about the strengths and weaknesses of the two campaigns, to leave and to remain, I actually think that vote was years in the coming. I think it was years in the coming. And in many respects, I think, if we're honest about it, we can see all sorts of political mistakes and failings that may have led to that vote. And I think most profoundly, what has been challenged in recent years is the idea that each generation would do better than the next. And the idea that whatever our backgrounds and fortunes in life, the next generation would have it better, which was the unspoken promise of Britain. And we had it for a very, very long time. And I mean, and this I can articulate from a personal point of view, because my dad was a toolmaker and my mum was a nurse. And like many people of their generation, they didn't go on to higher education because they couldn't afford to, the families couldn't afford to. So they went straight out. And that's not a sob story, that was absolutely standard. But they, like everybody of their generation, I think, and the generation after them, comforted themselves that one of the ups and downs of life, their children would have a better deal. And it made them proud, it made them feel worthwhile, it made them feel at the end of their working lives that they could pass something on that meant something to them. And we didn't really talk about it much, but that's gone. I think now most people fear for the next generation. I don't think many people feel that we will be passing something better on to the next generation. There's all sorts of anxiety about jobs, about skills, about homes, about security, about peace, state of Europe. That unspeakable promise of Britain has gone. But I don't think it's just a betrayal of the young. It's heartbreaking, I think, for parents. But there was also something else. There used to be an optimism that we were finally doing away with class distinctions that have blighted Britain for centuries. That Britain was doing away with what the great Yorkshireman Harold Wilson used to call the outdated practices of aristocratic connections and inherited wealth. We thought we were moving away from that. But the Social Mobility Commission has found that only 1 in 8 children from lower income backgrounds is likely to become a high income earner as an adult. 1 in 8 children from lower income backgrounds is likely to become a high earner as an adult. Pretty shocking in the 21st century. And a child living in one of England's most disadvantaged areas is 27 times more likely to go to an inadequate school than a child in the most advantaged. Incredible. So, in a sense, why should it come as a surprise to us that many people in Britain feel disillusioned, disaffected, disempowered, and when asked about the state of the nation or whether this model works for them, answered no. And it's not just a narrow question, and that's why it's really interesting to be delivering this lecture in Leeds. I think there's a growing sense that power and economic opportunities are not distributed evenly across the country. Whilst some parts of the country may have grown, others have stagnated. Whilst in some parts of the country people feel that they've got the opportunities and access to institutions and infrastructure they need to be in control of their lives, in others people feel ignored and disempowered. Whilst in some parts of the country people feel that the economic model gives them opportunities to prosper, in others people feel it's becoming harder and harder to build a life for them and their families. And as a Remainer who wanted to stay in, I don't much like the phrase that was used by those that were campaigning to leave, to take back control. But I keep thinking about it, because that phrase, I think, above all others, was a Heineken phrase. It got into different people in different ways and spoke to them about their lives. And it tells us something about what we need to do going forward if we're to bring this country back together. So that division needs to be urgently rectified. I think devolving political power and resources into our communities has to be at the heart of it. And I mean really devolving power and resources. Now, there has been devolution, obviously, in London to some extent, certainly Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. But in the regions, we're only really beginning to see the same sort of process in relation to powers and resources. And although there has been some progress, it's not even. It's actually very uneven. Sheffield, I think, is to have a metro mayor and devolved powers in 2 weeks' time. Leeds isn't. And some city regions are getting far fewer powers and resources than others. And I think that devolution of powers has to be in the forefront of our minds as we go forward, both on the international stage and nationally. So far as the international stage is concerned, as we leave the EU, powers that are currently exercised and resources to some extent, that to some extent come from the EU, will be coming back to the UK. And I think that they should bypass Whitehall so far as possible and go to the countries and the regions of the UK, not get sucked into Whitehall in London, but actually go straight out to the regions and straight out the different parts and nations of the United Kingdom. But it's not enough for us to just think about how the Brexit deal will go, and we can have a discussion about that. What's the best deal? How's it going to work? What's the timetable? What's the process? In a nutshell, I think that it's going to take a lot longer than the 2 years, and it should be allowed to take longer than the 2 years. That we should have a sensible Article 50 deal with transitional measures for a number of years until we get to a final new EU-UK treaty. And I think that treaty should be based on the principles of collaboration and cooperation that I believe underpinned membership. We can't have membership, but we should have partnership. But I think we also need to recognise that if there's any truth in the idea that the vote on the 23rd of June was a vote on the state of the nation, even a good deal, the best deal that we're capable of negotiating, will not on its own begin to address the issues that led many people to vote in the way they did. Because to some extent it simply puts us back in the position we're in now. And we need to address those issues. So whilst devolution will play a role, whilst negotiating the right deal will play a role, there needs to be a national response. Now, as Democrats, we have to accept the referendum result, and we have to find a sense of direction for our country. And for me, I think this is when we have to fall back on our values as we reshape our place in Europe, our place in the world, and reshape Britain. When it comes to the challenge of our place in the world, my values are clear. As I've said, I'm an internationalist. I believe our country should be outward-looking. I think we achieve more when we work with members of the international community than when we act alone. And I fundamentally think that we should face international challenges together with our colleague countries and take opportunities together. And if you just close your eyes for 2 or 3 seconds and think, what are the really big challenges out there in the world? Peace and security, terrorism, climate change, globalization without control. All of these issues are international issues that can only be solved internationally. And therefore, whatever the new arrangement, it has to be one based on collaboration and cooperation. And that's why I set out earlier this week an approach to Brexit would be guided by those principles. Obviously, there's been a lot of discussion about the trading arrangements. Now, this time last year, maybe some people in this audience can answer this differently, but most people I was talking to didn't know much about the inner workings of the customs union or the single market. It wasn't a topic of discussion. I think if 12 months ago today you walked into any bar and said, what's the customs union? People simply wouldn't have known what you're talking about. But now this is standard discussion with very, very many views. And in my experience, everybody's got a view, but no two people have got the same view. And there's been a lot of words said about the customs union, the single market, et cetera, and a lot of ink spilled. Now, when it comes to the trading arrangements, what I've done is to go around the country in my role as Shadow Secretary of State for exiting the EU and talk to lots of people. Now, just before I tell you what that's about, just on that title, Shadow Secretary of State for exiting the EU. Now, I'm sure And there'll be students in this room that, you know, there are times in your life where you think, these are the things I might want to do in my life, sort of a little list under the bed. I have to say, on my list under my bed of things I might do in my life, Shadow Secretary of State for exiting the EU was not on them. And from a political point of view, just excuse me for one moment and treat it with a pinch of salt, there are two things wrong with that title. The first is the shadow bit, because if you're shadow, you're in opposition. And that makes you're not making the decisions. It doesn't matter which political party you are, you're not making the decisions. And that's a deep frustration. I mean, when I was Director of Public Prosecutions, we had lorry loads of problems arrive every day, consistently. But at least it was my job to do something about it, and I had the ability to. Now, whether I did it well or not is for other people to judge. But I had the powers to try and solve the problems. If you're shadow, you're taking the edges off somebody else's decisions. You're not making the decisions. So that's the first thing that's wrong with it. And just to give you an evidence of what being in opposition really means, in my first 12 months as an MP, I voted 170 times through the lobby. We've got this old-fashioned business where you don't press a button or it's not electronic. You walk through a lobby. It takes 15 minutes for each vote. We walked through a lobby 170 times to vote on various issues, amendments, clauses, motions, you name it. We defeated the government once. And that's Exhibit A of what shadow is. And then Shadow Secretary of State for exiting the EU, obviously as somebody who wanted to stay, now negotiating and having a view on how we leave is an odd position to find oneself in. But in that role, and going back to the trading arrangements, and putting on one side the labels, members of the single market, access to the single market, in or outside the customs union, put all that on one side. What I've done is go around the country and talk to different communities, talk to trade unionists and talk to businesses, large and small, doing different types of things. And I've talked in the last 6 months to hundreds of businesses and many groups of businesses. And for all of them, in all the discussions, I've said, don't talk to me about single market customs union. Just tell me in straightforward terms what you need to see in place to trade as successfully in the future as you're trading now, just in practical terms. And I did the same exercise with trade unionists and with people working within those firms. And it's really incredible, because if I ask that question of Rolls-Royce, or unite the union, I've got the same answer. I've never known a time when trade unionists and businesses have all said back to me the same thing. And there's only four things that they're really concerned about. They're concerned about tariffs, particularly in the manufacturing sector. And the best example of that is automobiles and car making. Because, as you know, I was in Vauxhall the other day, up in Ellesmere Port, where they assemble the Astra. And there are hundreds, if not thousands, of bits that need to be assembled in the plant. And they come from all over the EU. And every time one of those crosses a border, if there's tariffs in place, there's a potential for picking up a tariff. And when the car's finished, I think it's 4 out of 5 of their cars, broadly speaking, are exported to Europe. And if that picks a tariff up on the way out, you can see why they're very concerned about tariffs. And it's the same for different industries. So first thing that businesses and industries have said, look, tariffs are a bad idea. So there should either be no tariffs or very low tariffs. That's fairly straightforward. The second is customs burdens. Businesses and trade unionists do not want customs burdens. They don't want checks at the border leading to delays, and they don't want bureaucracy that takes time. And this is very interesting, again, because the business model has changed in the last 20 years, and many people here who are involved in business will know that. But everything is done to just in time. So if you make cars, you remember you used to have great car parks of new cars that would be made, and they'd wait for the order, and when the order came, a few of them would be moved along. That's not how it's done anymore. They're all made effectively to order, and all parts are made to order. And therefore getting everything from A to B in the right time really matters. So customs checks are a bad idea. Then there's regulatory alignment. Now, I bet not many of you were talking about regulatory alignment this time last year. But actually, this is the thing that bothers industries and businesses much more than customs and much more than tariffs. Because if you're selling into Europe, you are going to have to comply with the EU regulations, whether the UK is in or out of Europe. Because to get it into that market, you've got to comply. And most businesses are very anxious that when we exit, and therefore we're out of those regulations, that we don't have new regulations of our own which are different. That's really simple, but it's a real big problem. So, I mean, the best example I can give of this is Airbus, which is, they make aircraft wings. A lot of them are made in Wales. They're a fantastic plant. They make the wings, massive wings. And they stick them on a lorry, and then from the lorry they go onto a boat, and they go round to Toulouse, where they're put together to make an aeroplane. And the other bits of the plane come from elsewhere. And in order for that to happen, they have to comply with the aerospace regulations for the EU, which are very controlling of the techniques, very controlling of the plan, very controlling of the specifications, and very controlling of the health and safety aspects of putting an aircraft together. And you'd want that. You'd want that. You'd want, if you're getting on a plane anywhere in Europe, to know that there's some pretty strict rules that have been applied to the putting of the wing on. Next time you look out the window, look at the wing. You think, do you want this to comply with EU regulations or not? I know what I want. And so Airbus say, look, we have to comply with these regulations. They're a bit of a pain, like all regulations, but actually they're a very good thing. And what we don't want is to find ourselves in a situation where, after we've left the EU, our sovereignty is exercised in such a way that regulation, because there'll have to be regulations here for aerospace, are any different to the EU regulations, because otherwise we can't sell our wings into the European market, we can't do business, we'd have to move or go bust. So regulatory alignment really matters. And the fourth thing that really matters is workplace rights. Because one of the things that Europe has given us is common standards on workplace rights, which means, broadly speaking, that workplace rights have enhanced over the years. And as they've enhanced, no one country can strip them away and make itself more competitive by reducing workers' rights. And in all my discussions, they're the only things that have mattered. Tariffs, customs, regulatory alignment, and conformity of workplace rights. And that's why in the plan I unveiled on Tuesday, I made that the heart of what we need to achieve. And I don't think there's many people who disagree with that. It's just how we get there. And whether that's, to go back to the argument, whether that's actually achieved through reform of the single market, the customs union and regulations, or whether it's achieved through some sort of bespoke agreement, actually is secondary to the outcome. And we mustn't let form trump function. We need to ask ourselves what it is are we trying to achieve. But of course, although a lot of the discussion about Brexit has been about trade, our discussions can't be limited to trade because we have done brilliant work in the fields of science, technology, education, etc. with our European partners. And I think, therefore, that we should be absolutely clear from the outset that we want to remain, if it's possible, part of the Erasmus scheme. So British students have the same educational opportunities after we leave the EU. That should be one of our priorities. We should ensure the UK maintains a leading research role by staying part of Horizon 2020 and its successor programmes. We should seek to maintain membership of, or at least equivalent relations with European organisations which offer benefits to the UK, such as Euratom, the European Medicines Agency, Europol and Eurojust. And this bit's party political, so just forgive me, but one of the things that I was most concerned about in the Prime Minister's Lancaster House speech and in the White Paper was when she said we want out of the EU and all parts of the EU. And that meant coming out of all those agencies, rather than saying, let's at least have a discussion with our EU partners as to whether it's possible to stay in some of these agencies. And some of the agencies are agencies I've worked with. So Europol and Eurojust are agencies I've worked with. So when I was Director of Public Prosecutions and Head of the Crown Prosecution Service, I had staff in those agencies in The Hague. And as their name suggests, they are hubs, they are places where all 28 countries come together, literally around a series of desks, to solve problems of terrorism and serious crime. And they really matter and they really make a difference. And that's why simply getting out of them before trying to stay in them, I think is a cause of real concern. And just to give you an example of what they do, there is the obvious stuff, which is sharing data and intelligence. On what basis do you share data and intelligence? Now, security and intelligence agencies are very, very good. They guard their data and intelligence very tightly, obviously. Where it's released to, when it's released, in what time, matters to them. And having common agreements about when that data is shared makes such a difference when you're dealing with terrorism. Coordinating is done through those two bodies. And it is blindingly obvious, but it is worth spelling out. For almost all major crime, there's an international element. And for all major crime, whether it's human trafficking, whether it's drug smuggling, whether it's guns, you name it, so far as the UK is concerned, it nearly always involves an EU country. And therefore, a typical investigation will involve the teams in The Hague tracking different people in different countries in real time and coordinating and agreeing when there's going to be an arrest. Now, if you've got a gang that's spread over several countries involved, let's say, in people smuggling, you need to have an agreement that the arrest is going to take place in every country at the same time. Bang on, to the minute, to the minute. Because if you arrest somebody in Rome at 6 a.m. and try to arrest somebody in London at 6:15 a.m., there won't be anyone in London. So you've got to, that coordination is going on 24/7. That's what happens in these bodies. And then there's other mundane stuff. Do you remember the killing, Annecy killing, the cyclist and the BMW, the family? What was set up there using Europol and Eurojust was a joint investigation team, which meant that whatever evidence was gathered in France was usable in the UK if necessary. And so by using these bodies, we have built in sort of mutual recognition of evidence, because otherwise there's not much point collecting evidence in one country if it can't be used in another country. And the same with convictions. We've aligned reliance on convictions. If someone's been convicted in one country in Europe, that is evidence of the conviction in another country. And that really matters. If someone's arrested for rape or murder in the UK, a decision has to be made pretty quickly on whether they're going to be released on bail. I'm not talking about convictions for trial, which is months or weeks or months down the line. Bail comes up within hours. And in cases where somebody is accused of rape or murder, it matters whether there's a provable conviction for a similar offence. It matters a lot, and probably will determine the bail outcome. So having those arrangements in place, mutual understanding, mutual recognition of convictions. And then, of course, there's other tools such as the European arrest warrant. And the best example, it's pretty well known, but it is just worth reminding ourselves of the European arrest warrant, is the capture and return of the 21/7 bomber from London. Everybody remembers, particularly if you're from London, where you were on 7/7. We all remember that day profoundly. I mean, it was an extraordinary day. And one of those moments where you will always know where you were, what you did. Of course, 2 weeks later, on the 21st of July, there was an attempt repeat with 5 bombers going to buses and to underground stations. And the only reason 21/7 is not remembered in the same way as 7/7 is because the detonators didn't work. They tried to detonate their packs, but for some reason, what they were trying to detonate had degraded and it didn't catch. I mean, it was complete luck. Now, 4 of them were caught within the first week or 2 weeks, but one of them, you may remember, escaped to Italy and went to Rome using his brother-in-law's mobile phone. And sharing data, working together with the Italian police, he was tracked down because of the phone, as it happens, being able to share data that we held on the phone, that they had on the phone. It was possible, as you know, using some of those techniques to home in on where the individual was. He was caught in Rome. Because of European standards, because of human rights standards, he was treated properly in custody. All rights were respected. Right to a lawyer was respected, etc. That knocked out any application for abuse of process when he eventually came back to this country. There was a European arrest warrant, and within less than 2 months, he was back in Woolwich Crown Court facing charges of conspiracy to murder using the European arrest warrant. Now, anybody in this room know how long it used to take to get someone back from Italy before the European arrest warrant?
7 years.
10 years. 10 years. Now, we had the anniversary of 7/7, obviously just a couple of years ago, and the idea that one of the 21 7 bombers would only just be arriving back would be, I think, at least a talking point amongst people about how... So the idea of coming out of these arrangements is obviously profound cause for concern, particularly in that field where I used to work. But those values also need to guide us about what we do back in Britain. And I have been very concerned, and we have pressed hard on the question of the EU nationals living in this country. There's 3 million or so EU nationals in this country. Now, obviously, they're very anxious about their position. And I have had people who've lived in this country for 10 or even 20 years in tears in my surgery about the uncertainty. And it's no good saying to people, it'll probably be all right. I'm sure it'll get sorted out in the long run. And I think it probably will. I mean, I'm not pretending for a moment there'll be mass deportation, of course not. But the anxiety that people have about what is my actual status, and will I be all right? What does it mean for my children? Will they have those same rights as me? Am I sensible putting them into the school or not? Would it be better just to go? These are conversations I've had with people in my advice surgery. And I think that we should have unilaterally acted to guarantee their rights before the negotiations started. And I think that would have been the right thing to do. I think it actually would have got the negotiations off to a better start, because our EU partners have read our approach as meaning we don't want much to do with them, or we're not prepared to guarantee the status of their citizens. Now, I accept, in fairness to the Prime Minister, that she tried to do this on a reciprocal basis. She did. And I have no doubt that both she and David Davis genuinely want to get this resolved. I'm not making a cheap point here. I genuinely think that's the case. But I think having failed to get a reciprocal arrangement, we should have acted unilaterally and done the decent thing by the people that are living here. And that's not to let down our UK citizens abroad, most of whom, incidentally, have formed groups where they've written to say, for heaven's sake, don't hold up the rights of EU citizens in the UK for our sake. Get on with it and do the decent thing. So that is something which should have been sorted out. But going forward, there is the big question, and it underlines this election to some extent, is to what sort of Britain do we want to build post-Brexit, and what are the values that are going to underpin that? Earlier I identified declining living standards for the next generation, the entrenchment of class privilege as two of the greatest challenges for our country. And I think they need to be at the heart of any future vision for our country. They're heart of the challenges that we face going forward. And they reflect my values and belief that Britain should be a society that shares opportunities, wealth and power, and is in the hands of the many rather than the few. And my belief that Britain works best when people feel they're working to improve the lives of the next generation. Now here it would be very tempting to get into party politics. So I'm going to resist that temptation, but just say they are very obviously the challenges that we face, and against which the future has to be judged. And I think that's a future worth defining. I think it's a future worth setting out, and I think it's a future worth fighting for, because I don't think that we can unite our country until we address those issues. In the end, 52% voted to leave, 48% voted to remain. Very close, very close. For virtually half the nation, the 23rd of June was a fantastic day. Independence Day, a great day. And yet for the other half of the nation, it was a day of grief, the worst day, and it still felt that way. And whatever we do to shape Britain post-Brexit, we've got to shape it in a way in which both groups feel comfortable in their own country, that they are respected, and that they've earned a place in shaping the future. And whatever sat behind that box, in or out, writing yourself out of your own history was not one of them. Nobody, whichever way they voted that they would not be shaping their future, the future of their children, the next generation, by voting the way they did. And so however we do this, we've got to bring the country back together and ensure that it's a tolerant country capable of accommodating both views, respecting both views, and allowing everybody to live comfortably in their own skin and in their own country. And sooner or later, we've got to start abandoning the reference point of how you voted as being of any significance and importance, and simply a historical fact. I'll leave it there and pick up anything else in questions. Thank you very much for your attention.